This episode of Trifles is brought to you by the Baker Street Journal, the leading publication of Sherlock Holmes scholarship since 1946. Find them online at bakerstreetirregulars.com. Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the lip was twisted, the soldier was blanched, and the men were dancing, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Have you ever stopped to wonder about whatever happened to Inspector Gregson? Or Mrs. Hudson's husband? Or of Holmes's early clients?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 174, A Kernel of Truth. Well, hello and welcome once again to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we talk about some of the details in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And I'm reporting for duty, Colonel.
Oh, excellent. Well, there's a kernel of truth lodged in between my teeth from last night's popcorn.
Oh, that kind of kernel. Well, I believe we're going to have a hominific show for you today. Well, if you would like to get to the show notes for this episode and actually see how we spelled Colonel, that would be helpful. You can go to ihose.co/trifles174, and that takes you to SherlockHolmesPodcast.com, which is our homepage. It actually takes you to the specific episode from that homepage. And you can root around there and see what else is going on. We do encourage you to help support the show for as little as $1 a month. Your contributions help us send emails, pay for hosting costs, for email distribution, etc. It all goes toward a worthy cause, as you know, from the iHose Media Network. Of course, you probably listen to our other show that comes out twice a month, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, and funding for that goes to help support transcripts for that show. We do appreciate your support either way. Well, let's talk a little bit about the military. You know, we've had military shows here before, and I don't have my notes available offhand, but I know we have talked about the military, and I will put links to those episodes in the show notes, so check those out if you'd like to hear what else we have to say on military matters. But, Bert, the reason this topic came to mind is because in the last episode, you remember we talked about the Reigate Squires, and Colonel Hayter was the individual who hosted Holmes and Watson at his country house. And in Martin Dakin's A Sherlock Holmes commentary, he says this about Colonel Hayter. He holds, unless I'm much mistaken, the curious distinction of being the only colonel among those who crossed Holmes's path who was respectable. This may be a surprise, but Holmes had remarkably bad luck with colonels. Now, what do you make of that, just off the top of your head?
Well, I guess it's true. You know, it's one of the nice things, one of the many nice things about D. Martin Dakin's book, A Sherlock Holmes Commentary. You know, his perspective, and this was back in the 70s, I guess, his perspective on the canon and the things that interested him. It's really a worthwhile reference. But it's a very good comment, because when you ask about Sherlock Holmes and the position of colonel in Her Majesty's military, you immediately think of Colonel Sebastian Moran, but then there are a great series of others, all of whom are not very they're either rude to Sherlock Holmes or they're nefarious in one way or another. And so Dakin's observation that Colonel Hayter may be the only, and look at the name too, Colonel Hayter.
Don't be a hater.
He may be the only respectable colonel that Holmes ever encountered. And we know from the Reigate Squires that he also was a patient of Watson's when Watson was in Afghanistan.
That's right. That's right. Now, just a bit of background here so we can understand the terminology. If we go to our friends at Wikipedia and look up colonel in the British Army and Royal Marines, it ranks below brigadier and above lieutenant colonel or lieutenant colonel. Why do the British pronounce it lieutenant?
Oh, I have no idea.
You've noticed that, right?
Yeah. No, lieutenant, in Britain. But why I have no idea what the ontology of that is.
Yeah. Well, maybe we'll explore that another time. But British colonels are not usually field commanders. Typically, they serve as staff officers between field commands at battalion and brigade levels. Now, that's interesting to me because when you think about someone spending their career in the Army, and usually in those days, a position, an officer position in the Army was purchased. I think we discussed this before. This is something that more well-to-do families had the ability to do. And when you're a colonel, if you're not a field commander and you're just serving on staff, I would imagine that those sons who had risen to that level might have been a little frustrated in their office jobs. You know, they saw all the action going on around them. They saw the strategy that was being planned. And yet, here they were, relegated to a staff job, not actually serving out in the field. That had to build up a lot of angst and frustration. And that in turn must have been, it must have flowed downhill, so to speak. And that frustration must have been expressed in some way. And here we have, a number of colonels, as we're going to talk about, who were not so very nice people. You think there's any truth to that psychology?
Well, I like it, as a hypothesis. I like it as a hypothesis. I don't know what more to say about that. I think that's very clever.
All right, we'll go with that. So let's talk about the most famous colonel of them all. You already mentioned him by name, Colonel Sebastian Moran. Now, here's an individual who clearly served in the Indian Army and is he's well regarded by Holmes just in terms of his abilities. He was clearly an excellent shot. He was, of course, he was Moriarty's right-hand man. And
he was the second most dangerous man in London. We have, I think, some information from Holmes about his antecedents. He was born in London in 1840, the son of Sir Augustus Moran, C.B., the former British minister to Persia, served in a whole bunch of campaigns that are listed, and an author. He's the author of Heavy Game of the Western Himalayas, 3 Months in the Jungle. His clubs included the Tankerville and the Bagatelle Card Club. And Watson wrote someone wrote, with the brow of a philosopher above and the jaw of a sensualist below, the man must have started with great capacities for good or for evil, but one could not look upon his cruel blue eyes with their drooping cynical lids, or upon the fierce aggressive nose and the threatening deep-lined brow without reading nature's plainest danger signals.
That's a wonderful
Isn't that great?
description.
Drooping, cynical, fierce, aggressive, threatening. What a bunch of words to put in somebody's physical description.
I know. And yet they were perfect. They were perfect to describe Moran and his personality. So Holmes said, as you mentioned, second most dangerous man in London. And Watson, after hearing all of these accolades about Sebastian Moran in Holmes' index, under his collection of M's, which was a fine one, Watson said, "This is astonishing," said I as I handed back the volume. "The man's career is that of an honorable soldier." And Holmes answered, "It's true. Up to a certain point, he did well. He was always a man of iron nerve, and the story is still told in India how he crawled down a drain after a wounded man-eating tiger. There are some trees, Watson, which grow to a certain height and then suddenly develop some unsightly eccentricity. You'll often see it in humans. I have a theory that the individual represents in his development the whole procession of his ancestors, and that such a sudden turn to good or evil stands for some strong influence which came into his line of pedigree. The person becomes, as it were, the epitome of the history of his own family."
Ah, there we have it. Sherlock Holmes, genetic theorist.
The twisted family tree. But that is the very case where you had somebody who was extraordinarily successful, well regarded in his own right. Colonel Sebastian Moran, once of Her Majesty's Indian Army, the best heavy game shot that our Eastern Empire has ever produced. And yet he turned his shot toward crime, toward Sherlock Holmes, taking him out of the running. So
it's interesting, though. I mean, it's just nice to dwell on that for a minute. Talk about trifles. It's another one of these lovely things, because in Holmes's observation there about the twisted tree, the twisted family tree of Colonel Sebastian Moran, what you have there, is a little summary, a little sense, a little indication, a characteristic of the whole Romantic age, in the late 19th century. The idea that, people looked around at nature and they saw people plowing fields, having to go around stumps of trees. They looked at twisted trees, how they grew in certain circumstances. And they took all of these analogies and observations from the natural world and tried to apply them to things like personality and characteristic. And it's just a lovely little thing. It's one of the reasons why, the literature of the Romantic age is so interesting to some of us.
I like that. And as we reflect on that, let's take a moment and reflect on this message from our sponsor. Spring is here, and that means the spring issue of the Baker Street Journal is beginning to arrive all around the world. In this issue, it's the usual lineup of great scholarship, like a re-examination of the Reichenbach Fall by Derek Belanger, and just his type, an analysis of the Decopay warning in The Hound of the Baskervilles by Jessica Schilling. And in this issue, a very special word from Wiggins. That's right, the Baker Street Irregulars have a new leader in Michael Keane. And in his inaugural message to all readers of the Baker Street Journal, he pens a wonderful, warm, and welcoming note. We hope that you will warmly welcome the Baker Street Journal to your mailbox and your collection by subscribing at BakerStreetIrregulars.com today. We're back talking about colonels in the canon, canonical colonels. And we already discussed the heavy game shot, the heaviest of all of the colonels that we come across. But let's talk about some of the other minor colonels that Sherlock Holmes encounters and where they lie on the spectrum of good and evil colonels. The first colonel we come across is Colonel Elias Openshaw. Of course, he was in the Confederate Army which is probably enough to color his character right there. But he rose to be a colonel, as we're told, by his nephew. Of course, this was not to end well for him because he was tracked down by the notorious organization that left him those 5 orange pips in the envelope that signaled his forthcoming death. And we all know how it ended for old Colonel Elias Openshaw. Not such a nice man.
No.
Who else do we have in the way of minor colonels? As opposed to major colonels.
Minor colonels, major colonels. We have, I've lost my mind. No, I've temporarily lost my list here that I was looking at. But I'll have acquired it back in just a second. Okay, so here it is. Well, we have, there was one of the Moriartys, one of the excess Moriartys. You know, when you buy a package of Moriartys, there are always a couple left over.
The 3-pack.
Yeah, it's a 3-pack. Colonel Moriarty. Now, there were a couple of James Moriartys, but there was also a Colonel Moriarty who tried to whitewash his villainous brother by taking away Holmes's character, much to Watson's chagrin and alarm. But we don't know anything more. Now, he was apparently not wasn't there a railway keeper who was,
station
something
master.
to do with the railway? Station master.
Yeah.
He's clearly not the station master. So there's at least 3 Moriartys there. So there's that one.
There is that one.
And then there's the terrible Colonel Berkeley, who did so much damage to his wife and to poor old Corporal Henry Wood, which you know very well.
I do, as Corporal Henry Wood being my investiture in the Baker Street Irregulars. Poor Henry Wood never had the chance to rise above corporal before he was sent off into an ambush by his friend and rival and colleague, James Barclay.
Now, here's something I never asked you. Why did you wind up with the investiture of Corporal Henry Wood?
Oh, that's a great question. So, I think there's a couple of reasons. At the time I was invested, I think it was 2001, January of 2001. I was recently engaged, so I was a young man, and I had been a longtime member of the Speckled Band, even by that time, and there was another military man who was one of my mentors, at least military by his investiture, Colonel Hayter. Speaking of colonels, that was Dan Poznansky. And the other leadership within the Speckled Band was Dr. John Constable, and his investiture was the Crooked Man. So between the military, the young man, and let us remember that in the Crooked Man, Corporal Henry Wood said, "It was for my good looks that she loved me." And the connection between that story, and also because I was a multiple quiz winner at the Speckled Band, Henry Wood was also noted as the smartest man in the 117th foot. So you put all those together and it points to Corporal Henry Wood.
Yeah, but boy, you don't know anything about how dumb the rest of the 117th foot were. You know. We've got to go over and see old Colonel Wood. Remember, he's the one who can tie his shoes without without the diagram.
That's true. I mean, if he was dumb enough to get hornswoggled into an ambush, you know, he couldn't have been that smart.
Oh, but that's a very nice story. You know, you in between Poznansky and Constable. That's very nice.
Yeah. Well, I only
because one would not have thought that any of the characteristics of poor Colonel Wood,
right,
would apply to you.
Well, let's remember he was the Crooked Man later on. He was Corporal Henry Wood in the early part of the story, back when he was young and good looking and smart.
Oh, that's true.
And those days are behind me.
So there must be multiple investitures. You can be invested as the crooked man, and you can be invested as Corporal Henry Wood too. Probably.
Sure.
Yeah.
Clearly, those days are behind me. So back to the colonels here. Let's talk about another colonel who wasn't necessarily evil himself or bad in any way, but he was a victim of circumstance, and that is Colonel Dorking. You, of course, remember the sudden end of the engagement between the Honorable Miss Miles and Colonel Dorking. That was at the hand of Charles Augustus Milverton, who revealed some nefarious activity. Although I will say this, I don't think it was revealed that it was an infraction on Miss Miles' part, nor was it on Colonel Dorking's part. So we could assume that Colonel Dorking was the one that had the secret to hide.
Oh.
So that could be it. Also, a very quick one. I mean, blink and you would miss it. In The Hound of the Baskervilles, Watson mentions the atrocious conduct of Colonel Upwood in connection with the famous card scandal of the Nonpareil Club.
Another great name, Colonel Upcott.
Is it Upcott or Upwood?
I thought it was Upcott, but maybe that's another colonel.
I may have mistyped it.
Well, I don't know about that. I may be misremembering it.
Well, in Dakin, he mentions it as Upwood, but in my PDF that I'm looking through here, the scan of the entire canon, it has Upwood. Final chapter of The Hound of the Baskervilles, chapter 15, a retrospection. It was the end of November, and Holmes and I sat upon a raw and foggy night on either side of a blazing fire in our sitting room in Baker Street. Since the tragic upshot, that's upshot, not Upcott, of our visit to Devonshire, he had been engaged in two affairs of the utmost importance, in the first of which he had exposed the atrocious conduct of Colonel Upwood in connection with the famous card scandal of the Nonpareil Club.
Oh, interesting. Well, Dakin has it as Upcott. Since I just looked. That's interesting. I'll have to get my money back on this volume at this era.
Let me take down my early edition. I'm looking through the very first copy of the Canon I had. No, I've got Upwood. Upwood. And here's another one. We discussed this just before the show started. I didn't realize this until I did a search that Sir James Damery was actually a colonel.
Oh yeah, that was a mystery to me too. I didn't remember his introduction.
Yeah. Well, I certainly remember him as Sir James, but if you read through The Illustrious Client, when he first made his appearance, he was Colonel Sir James Damery. Now, he himself didn't have anything negative going on with him. He simply brought the concerns of his employer along, the person who he was representing. So, of course, the connection there was in with the Baron and Violet de Merville. So, there's just kind of swirling around the Colonel. There is this whiff of nefariousness. Well,
and then there's Colonel. Did we mention Colonel Valentine Walter, who stole the Bruce Partington plans? No, that's a big one.
That's a good one. Yeah, nearly committed treason at the expense of his brother. Well, and let's not forget fake Colonel Lysander Stark from the Engineer's Foot. This was the German who, of course, hacked away at Victor Hatherley's thumb. And we should have known something was up because that story, The Engineer's Thumb, begins with a mention of Colonel Warburton's madness.
Oh, there's another colonel.
Yeah. I mean, look, it could have been, it was a fake case, or it was an unpublished case. It could have been Major Warburton's madness. It could have been Private Warburton's madness, Corporal Warburton's madness, but no. It was much better to have the staff colonel, the non-battalion overseeing, the non-field officer, Colonel Warburton, go mad in his office. And I would too.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, particularly considering how uncomfortable those offices were. You know, no air conditioning, no fans, windows closed, cigar smoke.
No phone, no lights, no motor cars, not a single luxury.
No.
Yeah, like Robert.
Then there's Colonel Emsworth, who was very rude to Holmes, and that's from The Blanched Soldier.
Yeah, he was not an easy one to deal with.
No.
So nearly every time Holmes encountered a colonel, there was something not good happening.
Yeah.
And that is just a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
Thank you, Watson, for educating me in military morality.